We're still looking at verses that use the word joy in Paul's letters. So today we're looking at the verses from Ephesians 4, verses 17 through 24. We're going to look at the first half of those verses today and the next half of those verses next week. These verses are in the part of Ephesians where Paul is giving practical instructions on how to live the Christian life. But everywhere he does it, he always bases what he says on who we are in Christ and what we've been given in our salvation. He's just finished discussing unity, and in this section he starts to talk about sexual purity, and he links it to the idea of truly knowing God. So in verses 17 through 19, he says that the pagan world falls into all the sexual immorality it does, partly because they've rejected the truth of God. And in verses 20 to 24, he urges us as Christians to live differently based on our having received the truth about God ourselves, and because he says we've been created in righteousness and holiness of the truth. So we're going to look at just the first part today, at what he says about how a sensual focus actually is linked to having rejected the knowledge of who God really is. Now, to do this, it's going to be helpful to look at another passage as well in Romans 1. Romans 1, 18 through 27 is an almost exact mirror of what's here in Ephesians 4. They make the same argument. Now, the Romans 1 passage is much longer, and the Romans 1 passage specifically addresses homosexuality as part of what it says, whereas this is talking about all sexual sin in general. But they're making basically the same argument about the connection between sensuality and what we know about God. Really, when it comes down to it, what both passages are addressing is idolatry and sensuality. And that's interesting because those were the two characteristic sins of the Gentile world. What I mean is, when the Jews thought about how they were different from the Gentiles, these were the two things that for them really distinguished their religion from pagan religions. One was idolatry. They were monotheistic. Every other religion out there all the other nations out there seemed to worship lots of different gods. It sort of baffled the other nations that the Jews were exclusive to their God, that they weren't allowed to worship several different gods. And the second thing, I believe, it seems to me that the Jews had a much stricter sexual code than almost any other religion or any other nation. For the Jews, God told them, only with a marriage. But other nations often went sort of crazy when it came to sexual activity, and they mixed sexual sin with worship a lot, which had things like temple prostitution, which for us is unthinkable. I mean, how could you distort holiness like that? So anyway, here's Ephesians 1 talking about sensual obsession and sensuality, a sensual focus, and connecting it to idolatry. Romans 1 does the same thing. Actually, before I get to that, let me just talk about what Ephesians 1 does talk about. You'll notice in verse 19 it says, they having become callous have given themselves over to sensuality for the practice of every kind of impurity with greediness. I want you to notice the link between greediness and sensuality here. It's a very interesting link. Paul makes that link in several different places. He uses the word greed right alongside the word for immorality or sexual sin, the words for those, in many different passages. And I think what he has in mind is he's thinking not just of a guy who slips once and has an affair or looks at porn or does whatever he does. He's thinking of a person who's sex obsessed, who's sensually focused. He's thinking of a person who has an addiction to lust, or whose life is revolving around finding physical thrill, to the point where that's all they live for. That was the situation of a lot of people in Paul's day in Greece and in Rome, and I think it's the situation of a lot of people today as well. And so Paul links that to knowledge of God, or to actually the lack of knowledge of God. So let's start with looking at it in Romans, and notice how he links it with idolatry. So Romans 1, he says, the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Notice he says they suppress the truth. What truth? Well, he goes on to say, because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes and his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so they're without excuse. What he's saying is everybody should be able to know, just by thinking about it, just by looking at what's been created. They should be able to know what kind of God God really is. And then it says, even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks. Now, when he says even though they knew God, he doesn't mean that they personally knew God. He means they knew something about God before their own sin got in the way. But unfortunately, it says they rejected God. They didn't honor him as God or give thanks to him. They wanted to be in charge of their own lives, and so they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened. They rejected the knowledge of God and turned instead to the false knowledge of what they put in its place. Professing to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man and of birds and of four-footed animals and crawling creatures. So notice two things here. Number one is that it emphasizes that men have deliberately rejected the truth of God. They're without excuse. But secondly, notice that the result is that they themselves did actually become deceived. Their foolish heart was darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools, so that they moved to the place where they really do not understand anymore what the truth is about God. Now, that's just the same thing as Ephesians says. If we look up above there, you'll see he says, "You walk no longer just as the Gentiles also walk in the futility of their mind, being darkened in their understanding." Remember, Romans said they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Here it is again, the futility of their mind, being darkened in their understanding. It says they were excluded from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them. But then says that is because of the hardness of their heart. So once again, it's a deliberate rejection of God, leading to a confusion, a misunderstanding of who God is. So the ignorance that is in them is because of the hardness of their hearts. Now, the next thing is that in both passages, Paul links this darkened understanding, this misunderstanding of the nature of God, to sensual greed. In Romans 1, he says simply this. He says, "Therefore God gave them over in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, so that their bodies would be dishonored among them." As a judgment on their rejection of the truth about God, God gave them over in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, so their bodies would be dishonored among them. What it's saying is, God said, look, you'd rather worship the physical than the spiritual? You'd rather worship animals than me? Then I'll turn you over to the physical. I'll let you live like animals, and you'll see what that's about. And so the sexual obsession that the pagan nations fell into is, from Paul's point of view in Romans 1, actually a judgment of God on their idolatry. If you leave the knowledge of God behind, you're left to fall into your own sensual desires. Now, at Ephesians, the same link is there, but Romans focuses on this being a judgment of God. He gave them over to impurity. But Ephesians focuses on it being the choice of the individuals. They have given themselves over to sensuality. So both of them are speaking the same truth, but from different perspectives. This says that they themselves have given themselves over to sensuality. So the idea is that rejecting the knowledge of God, I now turn and look to sensuality to be my God. I turn and look to sensuality to fulfill what I think ought to be true. And I find myself caught up in that. There's a really interesting picture of this just in Exodus 32. That's the story of the golden calf. And while Moses was on the mountain getting the Ten Commandments, the children of Israel had Aaron create an idol, the image of a golden calf, and they worshipped it. Now, I used to always sort of picture that as a kind of solemn bowing down to the idol, but that's not what it was. It describes them as throwing a kind of wild party as part of it all. It specifically says later on that Aaron let them get out of control to be a derision among their enemies. And the word there, get out of control, has to do with licentiousness. So their idolatry started out as worshiping an image, but it ended up in sensuality and lust. And that's a fascinating picture of what Paul is saying is sort of true in general for a whole culture. As our culture begins to reject God more and more, we find ourselves caught up in the sensual. We find ourselves caught up in sensual greed. All right, so let's come back to Ephesians. Even though Ephesians says that they gave themselves over, it still does, as I said, link this to rejection of the truth. So let's look a little bit and see how. Well, first of all, it says they're excluded from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them, because of the hardness of their heart. So Paul says they're excluded from the life of God because of the hardness of their heart. In other words, the pattern is they hardened their hearts to the truth about God, so they became ignorant of what God is really like, so they're excluded from the life of God. Hardening our hearts has a cost. Rejecting the truth about God has a cost. So what does Paul mean when he says they're excluded from the life of God? Well, partly, it obviously means that they don't have eternal life because they don't know the gospel. But that's not all he's getting at here. He's not just saying they don't know the gospel. He's saying this describes the way their life is lived. He's saying they don't know the life of God in their own experience. They experience their lives as being excluded from true life. They have a spiritual hole they can't fill, a deadness in their lives because they're alienated from true life. And we'll see that more in a minute. If we look at the next phrase, which says they, having become callous, have given themselves over to sensuality. So what does that mean? Well, again, partly it just simply means that their conscience is seared. They don't feel ashamed of the things that they would feel ashamed of if they knew what God was like. So because their hearts are hard, having become callous, their sense of right and wrong is turned upside down, and they're willing to do all sorts of things to pursue with greed all kinds of sensuality. But the thing about the conscience is, it's not only a source of guilt, it's also a source of joy. We feel the purest joy when we're living courageously as God has called us to live, when we're being who we're designed to be and we know that it's right. When we sear our consciences, we lose that capacity for pure joy. So in other words, a calloused heart means not feeling as much guilt, but it also means not feeling much else either. It's numbness. And that's the other reason why they pursue sensuality with greediness, almost desperately, is because they're missing the feeling of being alive. That's what Paul is getting at here partly, is that they're excluded from the life of God in their experience, and they become callous, and they don't have a sense of life. And so they pursue greedily anything they can find in sensual thrill, because that's the only place they can find that sense of being alive. When sexual sin spins out of control, that usually means that the problem isn't just physical, it's spiritual. It's not just the physical temptation of the pleasure that's tripping people up. It's that false sense of being alive again that feeds that spiritual hunger, that spiritual deadness, and that's what keeps them hooked. So the pattern that this passage gives is this. A man hardens his heart to the truth of God. He becomes calloused and insensitive to the pangs of conscience, and his understanding becomes darkened, and he's excluded from the experience of all true life. And his calloused heart becomes numb. It can't feel much. So therefore he throws himself with abandon and without shame into sensuality, because it's the only thing that makes him feel really alive. But it's still a lie, and it's still a trap. So we need rescue from this. And that's what the next passage, the rest of the passage goes into. What does this mean for us as Christians? Well, for us as Christians, it should be very different, because we've received the truth. It's changed us. It's given us a new heart. It's made us sensitive once again to God's leading. It's filled us with the experience of life in God. That makes a difference. And so that's what we're going to look at next week. Okay, thanks. See you later.